Thank you for your interest in Impact, a podcast series exploring multiple myeloma in African American communities. In this month's episode, Dr. Saad Usmani from the Levine Cancer Institute in Charlotte, North Carolina, will discuss the challenges associated with clinical trial enrollment for Black patients with multiple myeloma. Welcome, Dr. Usmani.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Let's start with the disease demographics. What we've seen in the SEER database over the past 4 decades is an ongoing increase in the rates of myeloma developing in Black American population compared to other races. Myeloma is the most common blood cancer in Black American population, and that number continues to go up. Now, if we start looking at 5-year relative survival by year of diagnosis and by race and ethnicity, we find that even though the access to care is not equivalent to other races and ethnicities, the Black American myeloma patients have continued to have an improvement at par with other race and ethnicity subgroups. If we dig a bit deeper into the disease demographics, looking at precursor conditions. So MGUS, or monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance, is the precursor condition that leads to multiple myeloma. That tends to occur at a higher incidence rate in African American or Black American population compared to others. And since the precursor is more common, hence the likelihood of developing multiple myeloma is also going to be more common. Now, the real biologic and immunologic reasons for this are not known, and this is an active area of interest in the myeloma research community. Now, if we start looking at realities of healthcare access, we find out that 21% of Black Americans, 18% of Hispanics, and 8% of non-Hispanic whites are living below the federal poverty level. Why is that important? It's important because that also translates into a higher proportion of these groups in the population being uninsured. So 10% of Black Americans, 18% of Hispanics, and 5% of non-Hispanic whites were uninsured in the year 2018. So if we look at different diseases, we find that 50% of Black Americans who have intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, they're 50% less likely to have surgery compared to patients who are white. Similarly, if we look at ductal carcinoma in situ in rural areas, 29% less likely to receive radiotherapy compared to breast-conserving surgery, for women living in urban areas. If we look at soft tissue sarcoma, we find the percentage of patients who are receiving neoadjuvant or adjuvant radiotherapy compared to those who have commercial insurance. So patients who don't have any health insurance, they don't get the optimal treatment. And the same is true for bladder cancer. And each of these different cancers tend to be more common in minorities in the United States. So Black Americans have twofold higher incidence of mortality from multiple myeloma compared to whites. Black and Hispanic patients with multiple myeloma are less likely to utilize stem cell transplantation and bortezomib treatment compared to whites. They also receive novel treatments later in the course of their diagnosis compared to whites. And there's a study that's also shown that Blacks may have a higher survival rate if they have equal access to novel therapies. And that's certainly what we find at our center, where patients have the same access to stem cell transplantation and clinical trials. But another very important harsh reality of the clinical trial enrollment scenario in the US is the low percentage of patients who are minorities, Asians, Black Americans, and Hispanic Americans who enroll on clinical trials, specifically If we look at the patients enrolled in FDA trials by race and by indication, we find that for myeloma, that the enrollment of Black American myeloma patients is only about 5%, whereas they make up 20% of the US myeloma population. So 1 in 5 myeloma patients is Black American, yet only 1 in 20 are enrolled on clinical trials. So if we look at the SWOG cooperative group clinical trial enrollment outcomes for multiple myeloma specifically, what we find is the outcomes of Black American patients in terms of estimated cost-specific survival are about the same compared to other race and ethnicities. So speaking to the point that if given the same access to care, the same access to clinical trials, the outcomes are going to be similar or potentially better.
Thank you for that discussion on the realities of clinical trial enrollment. So, what do you think are some of the barriers of clinical trial enrollment for Black patients?
Well, thank you for that question. Let me start with the various categories of barriers to African American or Black American myeloma patients to clinical trial enrollments. There are several groups of factors that can influence this. There may be issues with the trial itself. Looking at the eligibility criteria, there might be certain eligibility criteria that stack the odds against minority patients enrolling on trials. Then selection of sites, so sites that are geographically in a location that does not cater to minorities can be an issue. Then geographic access, which is a bit different from site selection. So there are areas in the country, in the United States, where the closest academic center or clinical trial center may be, 60 or 80 or 100 miles away from a community practice where the patient is getting their care, and that may be an issue. Then there are social and cultural issues, and this is a very broad category. So you can have social support issues. So, in our minorities, especially looking at, socioeconomic status, again, talking about geographic access too, patients who enroll on clinical trials require closer care and monitoring, and, they have to have strong social support mechanisms in place. Cultural sensitivities about clinical trials and what they really mean are important. People may have different understanding of what a clinical trial is, and perhaps may need more information and education, and they may have preconceived notions that need to be addressed. So it's important to have that candid conversation. This can be a barrier. And then uncertainty about the risk may reduce patient willingness to participate. So this is also important. And let's not forget structural racism, which is a very prevalent issue. And I'll talk a bit more about what can be done to overcome that. Then financial issues that patients face, are important. Routine care costs such as co-payments, co-insurance, or deductibles, taking time away from work for frequent clinic visits and travel to the site of the clinical trial, figuring out lodging, meals, dependent care, and transportation required for clinical trial participation. And then unknown adverse effects of the investigational agent. And therefore, you can have unknown expenses related to treatments of adverse effects, supportive care measures, for example, urgent care visits or hospitalizations. All of those things kind of play a role into decision to consider a clinical trial for our patients.
Those are all really great points. What are some possible resolutions to these barriers?
So from a clinical trial perspective, broadening the eligibility criteria, making it more inclusive and more real world, include trial design and study plan to encompass disease subtypes that are commonly seen in Black myeloma patient population, appointing a diversity officer for local trial site operations. I think this is a long-term solution that actually goes a long way. Each time you're planning to bring in a clinical trial, making sure that that diversity officer, sees the clinical trial enrollment plans. And then also enhancing the role of patient navigators in improving clinical trial enrollment. I think here, I can give an example of our site. Our patient navigator was actually a former research nurse, which actually helped tremendously in educating our patients and helping alleviate, their concerns about clinical trial participation. For social and cultural issues, establishing strong patient-doctor relationship is very important. Having an opportunity to hear and address patient concerns, talking to them about standard of care options, clinical trial options, pros and cons, helps establish that relationship. And then addressing their concerns, by empowering them with information, that gives them a greater confidence in their care team and helps alleviate their concerns about a clinical trial, and they would then adhere to the study requirements. And then if you're going to make a broader impact in a geographic area, forging partnerships through outreach, that includes social groups that are not traditionally approached for clinical trial enrollments, such as churches, sororities and fraternities, medical societies, and pharmaceutical companies can come together in having those important partnerships. And this tends to be an ongoing engagement, not a one-time engagement. And then talking to patient advocacy groups to build trust and encourage participation in trials and registry studies. Having patients share their trial experience with others to alleviate concerns, and also really create awareness about what it means to be part of clinical trials, and then develop pre-competitive programs that make resources available to support clinical trial infrastructure in treatment locations that are race and ethnicity rich but have not traditionally been part of the clinical trial ecosystem. I think that's very important, and that is a long-term solution. Then from a financial concern perspective, clarifying the definition of routine care cost from the onset and explaining that to the patients is important. Streamlining the prior authorization process. I know this is an ongoing challenge, and as we add more therapies, this becomes more challenging as well in terms of what different insurance policies cover and what not. Then providing patients with clear and transparent information about potential trial-related financial burden and resources available to help, such as financial navigation and counseling. And where possible, allowing ethically appropriate financial assistance for trial-related out-of-pocket expenses. Here, I think it's important to recognize that this is a fine line, and it needs to be done in a way that does not reflect coercion, of patients in participating in clinical trials. And then conducting additional research to help recognize and address the financial burden of clinical trials is another important potential solution.